It weighed over 50 tons. Its gun was a howitzer built to smash concrete bunkers, not fight other tanks. And in the last week of June 1941, German gunners hit it again and again and again, and watched their shells do almost nothing. This is the story of a machine so overbuilt that a single one of them could, by some accounts, hold up an entire German division for the better part of a day, destroying anti-tank gun after anti-tank gun sent to stop it. It's also the story of a machine that Soviet crews sometimes abandoned, not because the enemy destroyed it, but because it simply stopped moving, choked by its own weight on roads it was never built to survive. By the end of 1941, it was gone from production. Fewer were built than almost any other Soviet tank of the war, a few hundred units total, against the tens of thousands of other Soviet armor that would follow. And historians still argue, seriously, whether it deserves to be remembered as one of the most fearsome tanks of the early war, a machine German gunners genuinely feared to meet on a road, or one of the worst tanks the Soviet Union ever fielded, a rushed, overweight experiment that broke down more often than it fought. Both of those things are true. Here's how a tank can be both at once, and why the same 14 tons of steel that made it nearly invincible is exactly what doomed it. Before we go further, everything in this episode is sourced and cross-checked against published military histories, wartime and post-war accounts, and specification data from multiple independent references, not just the version of this story that gets repeated the most on the internet. Where the record is solid, we'll give it to you straight. Where it's genuinely disputed, and with this tank one specific engagement absolutely is, we'll tell you that too, and tell you why. Full source list is in the description below. To understand the KV-2, you have to start with a tank that isn't the KV-2 at all, and a war most people barely remember. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. It was supposed to be quick. It wasn't. Soviet armor ran straight into the Mannerheim Line, a belt of Finnish fortifications built into forest and granite, and found that their existing tank guns simply couldn't do the job. Standard tank cannons, even reasonably large ones, were designed to fight other tanks and support infantry against soft targets. They were not designed to crack open a reinforced concrete emplacement, and against the Mannerheim Line, that was exactly the job that needed doing. The lesson the Red Army took from the Winter War was blunt. They needed a vehicle that could carry a genuinely oversized gun, something closer to field artillery than a tank cannon, onto the battlefield, protected by armor thick enough to survive getting close enough to use it. The Soviets already had the beginnings of an answer. In 1939, the Kirov plant in Leningrad had just finished developing a new heavy tank, the KV-1, named for Defense Commissar Klement Vorlyshov. It was a solid, well-armored design on a fresh chassis, exactly the kind of platform you could build on. So Soviet engineers took the KV-1's hull and running gear and mated it to something almost absurd, a brand new, enormous turret built specifically to carry a 152mm howitzer. Not a tank gun scaled up, an actual howitzer, the kind of weapon you'd expect to find in a field artillery regiment, now rotating on top of a tank. That vehicle, initially fielded in small numbers before the Winter War even ended, became the KV-2. It arrived just in time to see limited action against the very fortifications that inspired it, giving Soviet planners an early taste of what a tank-mounted howitzer could actually do against concrete and log bunkers at close range. The reports were promising enough that the design moved into fuller production even as the wider KV-1 program was still working out its own problems. It's worth pausing on just how unusual a decision this was. Most nations solved the "we need a bigger gun than our tanks carry" problem with dedicated assault guns or towed artillery, vehicles built from the ground up around the gun, usually without a turret rotation at all, because a turret large enough for a true howitzer adds enormous weight and complexity. The Soviets, working under wartime pressure and an existing chassis they already trusted, chose the harder path. Keep the turret, keep full 360-degree traverse, and simply build the box big enough to fit the gun. It was an engineering compromise made under battlefield urgency, not in a research lab with years to iterate. And compromises made that way tend to carry hidden costs that don't show up until the vehicle is actually in the field, under load, in real weather, on real roads. Here's the thesis to hold on to for the rest of this episode, because almost everything that happens later traces back to it. The KV-2 was never designed to fight other tanks. It was designed to be mobile heavy artillery, a bunker buster that happened to have tracks and armor. Every strength it had in 1941, and every flaw that got its crews killed or left it broken down on a roadside comes from that one design decision. Keep that thesis close. It explains the miracle at Raseiniai and the mechanical collapse that followed it, and it explains both with the same set of facts. Look at a KV-2 next to almost any other tank in 1941, and the first thing you notice is the turret. It isn't proportioned like a tank turret. It's a tall, flat-sided box, welded together, that looks like someone bolted a small building onto a set of tracks. And in a very real sense, that's exactly what happened. KV-2. Key specifications. Main armament, 152mm M10T howitzer, 36 rounds carried. Secondary armament, 2 to 3 7.62mm DT machine guns. Armor, 75mm sides and rear turret and hull, up to 110mm on the hull and turret front in places. Weight, approximately 52 tons, early production. Later variants closer to 58 tons. Height, roughly 3.25 to 3.45 meters, well over 3 meters, among the tallest tanks of the war. Crew, 6. Commander, driver, gunner, radio operator or bow gunner, and 2 loaders. Engine, V2K/V2 12-cylinder diesel, roughly 500 to 550 horsepower. Speed, approximately 25 kilometers per hour, about 16 miles per hour, on road. Range, roughly 140 to 180 kilometers, depending on source and load. Start with the gun, because it's the reason everything else exists. The 152mm M10T howitzer was, by some measures, the largest caliber weapon ever fitted to a production tank turret. It fired a high explosive round weighing nearly 40 kilograms, nearly 90 pounds, and it could also fire specialized concrete piercing rounds, exactly what it was built for. Against the anti-tank guns Germany fielded in the summer of 1941, that gun didn't need to penetrate armor at all. A direct hit from a shell that size could simply wreck a lighter vehicle outright, sometimes tearing a turret clean off. But that firepower came at a cost baked into the design. The ammunition was so heavy and so large that it couldn't be loaded as a single round. It used two-piece ammunition, the propellant charge and the shell loaded separately by hand, by crewmen working inside a cramped, badly ventilated turret. That's slow under the best conditions. Under fire, exhausted, deafened by the gun's own report, it was brutal work. Sources differ on the exact rate of fire, but the consistent picture across accounts is a gun that could manage only a shot every 1 to 2 minutes in practice, an eternity in a tank engagement, and a window wide enough for an alert enemy to reposition, close distance, or simply run. Now the armor. The KV-2 carried the same base protection as the KV-1 chassis it was built on, armor ranging from about 75mm on the turret sides and rear up to 110mm on the front of the hull and turret in places. In the summer of 1941, that was, for a short window, close to untouchable. Germany's standard anti-tank gun at the start of Barbarossa was the 37mm PaK-36, and at normal combat ranges it essentially could not penetrate a KV-2's front armor at all. German troops nicknamed the 37mm gun the door knocker for exactly this reason. All it could do was announce itself. That's the paradox stat-carded right there. A gun almost too heavy to load fast, wrapped in armor almost nothing in the German arsenal could crack. For a few weeks in the summer of 1941, that combination made the KV-2 feel less like a tank and more like a fortress that had learned to walk. We'll get to why that didn't last. One more number worth sitting with: height. At well over 3 meters tall, the KV-2 was one of the tallest tanks fielded by any nation in the war. That turret, needed to give the loaders room to work with those enormous rounds, made the vehicle nearly impossible to hide and murderously easy to spot from a distance. On open ground, it could be picked out long before it could bring its own gun to bear on anything close enough to matter. Keep that in mind, it comes back later, and it comes back hard. Crew life inside the KV-2 deserves a mention too, because it shapes everything you'll hear in the sections ahead. 6 men worked in a space designed around the gun first and the humans second. The 2 loaders handling that 40-kilogram shell and its separate propellant charge worked in a hot, poorly ventilated compartment that filled with propellant fumes after sustained firing. Communication between crew positions in the noise and heat of combat was difficult even by the standards of 1941 tank design, which was already fairly rough on crews across every nation. None of that shows up in a spec sheet, but it shows up in how the tank actually performed once the shooting started. It's also worth noting what the KV-2 didn't have, because absence is data too. No stabilization system for the gun, no rangefinder beyond basic optical sights, no radio in every vehicle. Command tanks carried radios, but many KV-2s in the field relied on flag signals or simply following the lead vehicle. Standard practice across much of the Red Army's tank force in 1941, but a real limitation for a vehicle this specialized and this hard to coordinate in a fast-moving fight. Now, the story that made this tank a legend. A note before we tell it. The exact details of this engagement are genuinely disputed among historians, and we're going to be upfront about that as we go, rather than hand you a clean story that falls apart the moment you look it up. In the last week of June 1941, days into Operation Barbarossa, German forces of the 6th Panzer Division were pushing through Lithuania toward the Dubysa River near the town of Raseiniai. It was here that German troops encountered Soviet KV series heavy tanks for the first time, tanks their intelligence hadn't told them to expect, armed and armored well beyond anything they'd planned for. What happened next comes to us mainly through post-war accounts from German officers, including a memoir by General Erhard Raus, whose unit, Kampfgruppe Raus, was directly involved. According to that account, a single Soviet heavy tank got in behind German lines, onto a road being used to supply the advancing column, and simply stopped there. It destroyed a column of German supply trucks. Then it held the road. The Germans tried to deal with it in stages, and this is where the account gets genuinely dramatic if it's accurate. 4 50mm anti-tank guns of the division's anti-tank battalion engaged it, the standard German anti-tank weapon at the time, better than the Dornacher 37mm, but still, by these accounts, unable to finish the job. The tank reportedly took multiple hits and kept fighting, destroying the guns that had fired on it. German accounts describe attempts to bring up heavier weapons, including, in some versions, a 105mm howitzer and an 88mm anti-aircraft gun pressed into an anti-tank roll, before the position was finally overrun, reportedly after the lone tank ran out of ammunition. Depending on which account you read, this standoff lasted anywhere from most of a day to close to 2 full days. Here's where we have to hedge, hard, and it matters. First, what tank was it? Popular retellings, including most of what you'll find with a quick search, call it a KV-2, and it's easy to see why. The KV-2 is the more dramatic, more visually iconic machine, and it makes for a better story. But the primary sourcing does not settle this cleanly. Some contemporary and post-war accounts describe a KV-1, others describe a KV-2. Several serious historical treatments of the battle, including detailed research specifically built around this engagement, conclude that we genuinely don't know for certain and choose not to assign a type number at all rather than guess. We're going to be honest with you here, too. It may well have been a KV-2, it may not have been. Nobody has definitively closed that question, and anyone who tells you otherwise with total confidence is skipping past a real gap in the record. Second, the numbers. How many vehicles were destroyed, how many hours the standoff actually lasted, and exactly how the tank met its end vary meaningfully between sources, and a lot of the widely circulated version of this story traces back to a single post-war German memoir, not to contemporary Soviet records or independent corroboration. Memoirs written years after the fact by officers on the losing side of that particular exchange are useful historical evidence, but they're not the same thing as a verified after-action report, and military history has plenty of examples of a dramatic wartime story getting embellished in the retelling, intentionally or not. What isn't in serious dispute is that something like this happened. A Soviet heavy tank, alone, well behind the point where anyone expected resistance, held up a significant portion of a German Panzer division for an extended period, probably close to a full day by the most cited figures, inflicting real losses before it was finally destroyed. Whichever KV it was, and whatever the precise numbers, that's still one of the most remarkable single-vehicle stands of the entire war. We're telling it to you this way, hedged, sourced, honest about the gaps, because the alternative is telling you a clean, confident version that a tank historian in your comments section will take apart in about 4 minutes, and they'd be right to. There's a broader point buried in that murkiness, and it's worth naming directly. The fog around Raseiniai isn't unusual for the opening days of Barbarossa. Records from both sides were fragmentary. Soviet units were being encircled, destroyed, or scattered faster than paperwork could keep pace with. German units were advancing so quickly that thorough after-action documentation often came second to simply continuing the push. A single dramatic, well-told story from a German officer's post-war memoir filled a gap that contemporary records left wide open. And once a story like that gets told well enough, it tends to calcify into fact whether or not the underlying sourcing can support that certainty. Here's the part of the story that doesn't make it into the highlight reel. For every KV-2 that went out fighting, more were lost to something far less cinematic than German guns: the tank itself. The Soviet 2nd Tank Division, the same unit involved at Raseiniai, offers a clear example. Before it even reached the battle, its column of KV-1s and KV-2s had been on a road march of over 100 kilometers along dusty, unpaved roads. By the time they arrived, a significant number of vehicles, most of the KV-2s among them, as well as a number of KV-1s, had already fallen out of the march entirely, sidelined by clogged air filters and failing transmissions, before a shot had been fired at them. This wasn't a one-off. It was the pattern for the KV-2 across its short operational life. The chassis it was built on, the KV-1's transmission and running gear, had already been criticized as underpowered and fragile for the KV-1's own weight. Bolt an extra 14 tons of turret and gun on top of that, and the strain multiplied. Breakdowns were common. Spare parts and fuel, especially during the chaos of the initial German invasion, were often simply unavailable. And a tank that couldn't move under its own power and couldn't be recovered was, for practical purposes, gone, whether or not the enemy had ever touched it. There's a recurring detail across multiple accounts of KV-2s in German hands. Crews that captured an abandoned KV-2 sometimes used it until it broke down again and then simply abandoned it a second time, because it often wasn't judged worth the trouble of repairing. That tells you something about how these vehicles were actually experienced day to day, as opposed to how the Raseiniai story makes them sound. The honest summary, and the one this audience will already suspect if they know their armor: across 1941, more KV-2s were lost to mechanical failure, fuel shortages, and abandonment than were ever destroyed by German fire. The tank that could shrug off a 50mm anti-tank round couldn't always make it down a dirt road, and that gap between the legend and the logbook is the real story of the KV-2 in service.
If you know tanks, you already know most of what's coming in this section. We're not going to dance around it, because pretending these flaws didn't exist would insult everyone watching who's read a source document on this vehicle. Speed and mobility. At roughly 25 kilometers an hour on a road, and considerably less across rough terrain, the KV-2 was slow even by the standards of 1941 heavy tanks. It was never going to outmaneuver anything. It wasn't meant to. Rate of fire. We mentioned this in the specs section, but it belongs here too because it's a genuine tactical flaw, not just a curiosity. A gun that needs perhaps a minute or more between shots, loaded in 2 pieces by hand, is a gun that struggles in a fast-moving engagement against multiple targets. Against a single bunker, that's a survivable trade-off. Against a mobile threat that can maneuver in the time it takes you to reload, it's a serious liability. Turret weight and traverse. That massive turret, around 14 tons on its own, didn't just strain the engine getting the vehicle down the road, it strained the traverse mechanism too. Multiple sources described real difficulty, in some cases near impossibility, traversing the turret at all when the tank was on any kind of slope, because the mechanism simply wasn't powerful enough to fight gravity and that much mass at the same time. A tank that can't reliably turn its own gun on uneven ground has a problem no amount of armor fixes. Silhouette. We flagged this back in the specs section too. A height of well over 3 meters made the KV-2 one of the tallest tanks of the war, and that's not a neutral fact. It made the vehicle extraordinarily easy to spot from a distance, easy to range in on, and hard to conceal in the field. Everything that made the turret capable of housing that howitzer also made the whole vehicle a landmark on the battlefield. And there's one more flaw specific to the design that's worth naming plainly. Firing the main gun at certain turret angles could put dangerous strain on the tank itself, related to the sheer size and recoil of that 152mm weapon in a rotating mount never really built to handle full power shots in every direction with total safety margin. This wasn't a tank you could fire carelessly, even from inside your own lines. None of this erases what the KV-2 could do in the right circumstances. It just tells you why the right circumstances turned out to be narrow, and why the tank's operational record looked so different from its reputation.
The KV-2's production run was short. Manufacturing had effectively ended by late 1941. The Kirov plant itself was forced to evacuate from Leningrad to Chelyabinsk as German forces closed in on the city, and by that point the Red Army had already concluded the vehicle wasn't worth continuing. Total production is generally put at only a few hundred vehicles, commonly cited around 330 to 340, making it one of the rarest Soviet tank types actually fielded in the war, a fraction of the numbers built of the KV-1 or later the T-34. The reasoning for cutting it wasn't really about the gun. Soviet planners still wanted a mobile 152mm platform. You can see that in what came next. But instead of another oversized turret bolted to a heavy tank chassis, later vehicles like the Su-152 mounted a comparable gun in a fixed casement rather than a rotating turret. Lower profile, less mechanical strain, cheaper and faster to build. It was, in effect, the Red Army learning the KV-2's lesson and applying it. Keep the firepower, lose the vulnerable top-heavy turret. A small number of abandoned or captured KV-2s were pressed into German service, as was common practice with captured Soviet heavy armor early in the war, though consistent with the mechanical reputation we've already covered, several accounts suggest these captures were often used only until they broke down again and then discarded, rather than kept in long-term service. Today, the KV-2 is rare enough that surviving examples are limited. At least one confirmed survivor exists in museum collections, a rare physical link to a tank that spent less than 2 years in frontline service. So why remember it at all, given how short its story is? Because the KV-2 is one of the clearest examples in the entire war of a machine built exactly to spec and exactly to its own downfall in the same design. Every part of what made it briefly terrifying to German gunners in June 1941 is the same part that made it slow, fragile, and short-lived. It's not a tank that failed because someone built it badly. It's a tank that succeeded completely at the narrow job it was built for: smash a bunker, survive point-blank fire while doing it, and then got thrown into a war that mostly didn't ask it to do that job. So, back to where we started. In June 1941, German gunners hit a Soviet heavy tank again and again, and watched their shells do almost nothing. And within months, that same class of tank was pulled from production, under strength, unreliable, and largely replaced by something simpler. Both of those things happened. Neither one cancels the other out. That's the KV-2. If you want more of these, full single tank profiles, sourced properly, no invented kill counts, subscribe, and we'll keep making them. And here's the question for the comments, because I already know this one's going to run. The KV-2, monster or mistake? Tell me where you land, and tell me why.